They said she was gun-shy. They laughed behind her back, called her soft, called her dead weight. But when the final battle came, and chaos split the skies open, it wasn't the seasoned warriors or the grizzled commanders who turned the tide. It was her, shoulders squared, eyes steady, twin rifles in hand, standing tall where others fell. And what happened before that moment? That's a story almost no one tells, until now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever met someone who was so out of place, so obviously not built for the world around them, that you wondered how they'd ended up there at all? That's exactly what most people thought the first time they saw Evelyn Reyes step off the supply truck at Outpost Vanta. She didn't belong. Everything about her screamed civilian: delicate hands, wide-eyed glances, lips that quivered when the alarms rang. Among the dust, the rusted steel of the watchtowers, and the ever-present smell of gun oil and fear, she looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a library. People whispered that she'd bribed someone to get enlisted, or maybe her family pulled strings, or maybe, just maybe, she had no idea what she was doing. The truth was even stranger. Evelyn had volunteered. No draft, no pressure, no family tradition to uphold. She signed her name on the enlistment papers during one of the worst winters her city had seen in decades, wearing an oversized coat and shaking not from cold, but from a conviction no one around her could see. They didn't know the truth, and at the time she wasn't about to tell them. The military had changed by then. Gone were the days of standardized units and traditional battlefields. The resistance had fractured into smaller, rogue factions, and the enemy, if you could even call them that, was more an idea than an army. After the collapse, survival was up to regional outposts. No flags, no governments, just communities trying to keep what was left of the world from turning into ash. Outpost Vanta was one such place, tucked between the remnants of the Duskline Mountains and the ruins of what used to be the Northern Tech Corridor. Its population fluctuated between 200 and 300 people, depending on the season and how badly the raids hit. The outpost served as both a refuge and a front line, a haven and a trap. Everyone stationed there knew one thing: if you stayed long enough, the war would eventually come knocking. Evelyn arrived during a lull in the chaos. The last assault had happened 6 weeks prior, and though the outpost still bore the scars, charred walls, graves freshly dug on the eastern slope, a scorched water rig that still sputtered when overused, there was a temporary calm. A false calm. Veterans knew better than to trust it. But it was exactly during these quiet spells that new recruits were rotated in, trained, and tested. And so Evelyn came, quiet, observant, oddly graceful in a way that made some of the hardened soldiers scoff. She didn't talk much. She followed orders. She trailed behind during drills, always last to hit the marks on the range, always slow to raise her rifle, always blinking too much when the recoil hit her shoulder. She hated loud noises. Everyone could see it. Her fingers trembled when the larger artillery roared. Some said she had some sort of neurological sensitivity. Others assumed it was just fear. Either way, the label was quick to stick. Gun-shy, they called her. Pretty liability. Collateral in waiting. The cruelty was casual, whispered during lunch shifts or muttered after another failed drill. She heard it all, and yet she stayed. No one could figure her out. She didn't argue, didn't break down, didn't try to defend herself. She just kept showing up. Every morning at dawn, she was there in the gravel lot, boots laced, gear in place, posture straight. No shortcuts, no excuses. She did the work. Poorly, perhaps, but consistently. It was like watching someone drag themselves uphill with no clear goal in mind. What was she trying to prove? The officers debated moving her to a non-combat division, supply sorting, comms desk, medical tent, anywhere she wouldn't endanger others. But every time they brought it up, she politely refused the transfer. She wanted to stay on the field teams. She wanted to learn. No one understood why. And so, the mystery grew. Oddle. Then there was the journal. Evelyn kept it tucked in the inner pocket of her jacket, close to her chest at all times. No one ever saw her write in it, but she guarded it with a seriousness that raised eyebrows. During inspections, when asked to hand it over, her jaw would set in a way that surprised even the harshest officers. She'd hand it over without a word, let them flip through the blank pages, and then take it back as if it contained the answers to questions no one dared ask. To most, it was just another eccentricity from the girl who didn't belong. But to a few, those who'd been around long enough to sense that the surface rarely told the whole story, it meant something more. Maybe she wasn't gun-shy. Maybe she was just waiting. That was before the day the sirens wailed louder than they ever had before. Before the sky turned copper, and the enemy came not as raiders but as a flood. Before the outpost was surrounded, overrun, and cornered. Before every able body was called to defend the perimeter, and Evelyn Reyes, with her journal, her shaking fingers, and her too large helmet, stepped onto the battlefield one last time. No one knew then what she was about to do, but by the time it was over, no one would ever forget. Evelyn Reyes was the kind of person who faded into the background, not because she lacked presence, but because she'd learned long ago how to minimize her impact on a room. Her gait was steady but silent, her voice always a few decibels softer than necessary, and her expressions, though clear, rarely lingered long enough to be read. She was not the type to dominate conversations or draw attention with bravado. Instead, she observed, listened, absorbed. Even in moments of stillness, she seemed like someone who carried a noise within her that she worked hard to muffle. Most who met her would not have guessed she was only 25. Her demeanor, posture, and eyes gave off a quiet maturity that made age feel irrelevant. She could have been a weather-worn 35 or a remarkably self-possessed teenager. There was a timelessness to her that no one ever really knew how to categorize. Her life before the outpost was the sort of mystery she didn't volunteer to solve. If anyone asked, and very few did, she would deflect politely or offer vague remarks about growing up in the eastern drylands, about helping her aunt run a shipping stall along the old canal routes, about watching cities collapse on radio reports while stitching tarp panels under candlelight. She made it sound boring, as though she'd merely passed time while the world reshaped itself around her. But the truth was, even in those meager details, you could sense a life marked by adaptation, not inertia. There was a tension in the way she spoke about the past, like someone who had memorized the safest version of her story and refused to color outside the lines. She never lied outright. She just kept the full truth in a locked drawer. When she arrived at Outpost Vanta, the uniform they gave her was too big. She didn't complain. She cinched it at the waist, hemmed the sleeves in the barracks during her first night, and patched the worn knee seam with a needle borrowed from a medic. Her rifle was second-hand, a standard-issue 40C with a known jamming problem, and her boots, though sturdy, were half a size too tight. She accepted them all with quiet gratitude, not out of resignation, but as if she'd already expected that nothing would come easy here. While other recruits mumbled about conditions or joked their way through orientation, Evelyn treated each task like it mattered, no matter how small. That seriousness unsettled people. It was rare to find someone who behaved as though this place, this assignment, this moment might be life or death, even before the danger had arrived. It wasn't arrogance. It was awareness. She spent most of her off hours alone, either cleaning her weapon more often than necessary or sitting near the edge of the outpost's northern perimeter wall, where the fence line overlooked a wide, dead valley scattered with rusted debris and scorched transport hulls. It wasn't the most scenic view, but she always returned to that spot. Sometimes she read from a small, tattered handbook on field strategies, though the more experienced fighters often scoffed at it. "You don't learn to survive from manuals," they said. "You learn by bleeding." Evelyn never argued. She just kept reading, kept watching, kept returning to that same vantage point as if waiting for something or someone to appear on the horizon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Physically, she didn't look like a soldier. She was lean, maybe 5'5", with long black hair usually pulled into a low, functional braid and skin that had yet to take on the permanent sun-scorch that marked most of the veterans. Her posture was composed but not rigid, and though her frame appeared slight, there was a wiry resilience to it, like rope that had been stretched but never frayed. She didn't move with the same swagger or authority as those who'd earned their battle stripes, but there was a kind of internal alignment in the way she carried herself. It wasn't pride, it was precision. And she wasn't without flaws. On the range, she lagged behind the rest of her squad. Her shots were scattered, and though she eventually hit her marks, it was never on the first try. She flinched at loud bangs, and she blinked rapidly whenever an explosive went off nearby, as if trying to clear away ghosts only she could see. Her hands, while steady with tools and gear, hesitated when wrapping around the cold steel of her weapon. Her instructors noted these things in their logs, and the rumors among the ranks swelled accordingly. It wasn't just that she was slow, it was that she seemed afraid. Not of death, but of the mechanics of violence itself. It made her an easy target for ridicule. Yet, despite all that, Evelyn never missed a single training. She never slacked on her duties, never fell behind on her assignments. She completed every drill, repeated every rep, ran every circuit with dogged discipline. She helped others with their gear, covered for a squadmate who overslept, volunteered for extra shifts without being asked. She was the last to complain and the first to offer assistance. And perhaps that's what kept her from being completely alienated. Because even if she wasn't the best fighter, even if people didn't trust her in combat, they couldn't deny that she showed up, again and again and again. Some of the senior officers noted that kind of resilience. Sergeant Malik, who had seen 100 recruits break within their first month, watched Evelyn closely during their third week of drills. He said little, but in private reports, he marked something different in her behavior. "Not brave," he wrote, "but deliberate. She's not reacting, she's preparing. Just not sure what for." What no one knew then was that Evelyn Reyes wasn't trying to become a soldier in the traditional sense. She wasn't chasing glory or revenge or redemption. She didn't want medals or status. She was waiting for the right moment to become something no one expected. And when that moment came, she wouldn't ask for permission. She would simply act. Outpost Vanta was built not for comfort, but for survival. It rose out of the barren earth like a scar, jagged, weather-worn, and stubborn in its defiance of the desolation around it. Located in what used to be the upper mountain corridor between the dusk-line highlands and the scorched basin that once fed into the Arvo River, the outpost had been cobbled together from salvaged shipping containers, retrofitted bunkers, and whatever scrap metal could be scavenged from abandoned industrial zones. Its fences were tall and uneven, made from mismatched sheets of welded steel, reinforced by sandbags and fragments of old highway signs. Rust was the most consistent color on every surface. Winds howled across the flatlands beyond the perimeter, carrying with them the bite of ash and the fine grit of red dust that coated every surface, every uniform, every breath. The air was dry and unforgiving. During the day, the sun scorched the ground to such a degree that rubber soles softened and cracked within weeks, and exposed skin burned in under 15 minutes. At night, the temperature plummeted with such cruelty that frost would form inside the barracks windows, no matter how tightly they were shut. It was a place built on extremes, searing heat and cutting cold, long stretches of silence punctuated by sudden violence. Nature, in its dying throes, offered no comfort to those stationed there. And yet, Outpost Vanta persisted. It had to. It was one of the last active waypoints between the fractured northern sectors and the resource routes to the east. If it fell, entire supply lines would be severed, leaving countless settlements to starve, to freeze, or to fall to marauders. The outpost's layout was deceptively simple. At its center stood the command tower, an old air traffic control pillar from a defunct freight airport, reinforced with sandblasted cement and topped with a 360-degree surveillance dome. From its base radiated 4 main wings, barracks and mess to the west, armory and training grounds to the north, field hospital and quarantine unit to the south, and vehicle depot to the east. In between these quadrants were rough-cut paths and trenches that served both as transit and defense channels. Communication cables were strung haphazardly between poles, and makeshift shade tarps fluttered like tired flags over outdoor common areas. The only greenery came from a narrow hydroponic garden inside an old freight container, maintained by 2 retired medics who treated the plants like sacred relics. Most didn't go near it. It was a reminder of life before the collapse, and people here couldn't afford nostalgia. The atmosphere inside the outpost was a strange mix of hyper-alertness and exhausted resignation. Everyone knew the attacks were inevitable. No one knew when. Days passed slowly, routines repeating, with numbing regularity. Morning drills, midday supply runs, equipment maintenance, radio checks, watch rotations. Meals were bland, but calorie-dense, designed for function over flavor, and eaten in silence or low murmurs. Occasionally, someone would smuggle in music from a forgotten server archive, crackling old tunes from before the world went dark, and for a few minutes, the tension would ease. But laughter was rare, and joy even rarer. Every face carried the weight of memory. Every eye flinched at distant thunder, unsure whether it was weather or the prelude to shelling. Social dynamics were tight-knit, but hierarchical. Veterans shared an unspoken bond forged in fire. Those who had seen the worst of the collapse, who had buried friends without ceremony, who had learned to sleep through air raid sirens. Newer recruits either found a way to integrate or remained on the fringe. Trust wasn't given. It was earned through consistency, reliability, and the ability to remain calm when the perimeter lights turned red. Cowards weren't hated. They were simply ignored. The most dangerous thing to be in Outpost Vanta was invisible. To matter, you had to endure. The outpost had its own codes, too. Unwritten rules passed down through gestures and side glances. Don't sit in the far left corner of the mess hall. That table belonged to the sniper unit. Don't touch the gold pendant nailed above the comms door that was left for Lieutenant Harrow, who didn't make it back from Patrol 14. Don't mention the name Kershaw during evening watch. No one explained why. People carried superstition like armor. Some wore tokens around their necks, others tied red thread around their wrists, and many carved small symbols into their rifle stocks. Reminders, prayers, curses. In a world where tech had failed and systems had crumbled, belief had become the last infrastructure standing. And above it all hung the shadow of the threat they simply called the Breach. No one used its real name anymore. It wasn't just one faction or one group. It was a force. Roving bands of mercenaries, former military contractors, ideological zealots, and deserters from collapsed regimes who had merged into a chaotic, shifting collective that devoured settlements in their path. They didn't attack for land. They attacked to erase. Scouting drones sometimes caught footage of their movements. Long lines of dust trails, blackened war trucks outfitted with makeshift armor, flags made of torn uniforms, and the haunting roar of sound systems blasting looped static or distorted voices. Survivors from breached outposts rarely spoke of what they saw. The worst stories came from those who escaped with burns and bone-deep shrapnel, and eyes that never met yours again. Outpost Vanta knew its day would come. Everyone did. The only question was when, and whether they'd be ready. Each week more drones were lost. Each month more scouts failed to return. Each morning, the sun rose just a little more red. The ground, already dry, had begun to crack in ways that mirrored old war maps, veins of history repeating themselves. Evelyn saw all of this, felt all of it. And, unlike many around her, she didn't flinch away. She walked the same paths, breathed the same air, tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline in the back of her throat every time the alarms blared. But instead of letting the weight of the place erode her spirit, she internalized it, like pressure forming a diamond. Where others tried to survive by numbing themselves, she stayed awake, alert, absorbing every pattern, every protocol, every quirk in the routine. And as the weeks passed, she began to see something that others missed: the signs, subtle changes, small anomalies, a rhythm slowly breaking. And though no one had yet declared it, Evelyn Reyes knew what was coming. The breach was closer than they thought. And when it arrived, nothing in Outpost Vanta would ever be the same. They never came the same way twice. That was the most unnerving thing about them. The breach wasn't a uniform army or even a coordinated enemy in the traditional sense. It was a swelling storm of destruction, composed of splinter cells, rogue tacticians, ex-convicts turned field captains, and warlords raised on chaos. There were no emblems, no clear ranks, no written doctrine. They operated like a virus, mutating, adapting, always moving just beneath the radar until they chose to strike. The enemy wore mismatched armor, their faces often obscured by repurposed gas masks or smeared paint. They used repurposed weapons from dead regimes, enhanced with scrap tech and experimental mods stolen from abandoned research bunkers. If a weapon hissed or burned green instead of firing traditionally, chances were it had come from breach hands. Their tactics were unorthodox. They didn't follow the conventional patterns most defenders were trained for. They'd hit outposts with electromagnetic pulses to knock out long-range comms, then launch decoy raids from the east while planting IEDs along the western fences. They used psychological warfare too, broadcasting the names of fallen soldiers in distorted voices across open channels, or sending drones that dropped propaganda leaflets soaked in a chemical irritant that caused nausea and hallucinations. In one particularly brutal assault in the southern plains, they infiltrated a post's medical wing using a truck painted with the Resistance emblem, only to detonate a bioagent inside, turning the entire outpost into a quarantine zone that had to be firebombed. Stories like these spread like smoke through outposts like Vanta, and though leadership warned against, quote, paranoia-inducing rumors, everyone knew the threat was real. What set the breach apart wasn't just their cruelty, it was their intent. They didn't want territory, they didn't issue demands. They didn't claim political allegiance, or even attempt to create their own domain. They destroyed for the sake of it. Some speculated that the higher ranks within the breach believed in a complete reset, that humanity had poisoned the earth beyond repair, and the only solution was to wipe the slate clean. Others said they were mercenaries with no code, simply addicted to violence. Whatever their motivation, the results were the same. Any place they touched was reduced to ruins, ash, and blood. And the survivors, if any remained, were never the same. At Outpost Vanta, the senior strategists had long debated how to prepare for a breach strike. Lieutenant Maynard, the tactical lead, had studied every known encounter. She kept a wall of declassified photos, survivor sketches, and satellite images in her office, mapping movement trends like weather patterns. She believed there was a central figure behind their larger operations, someone known only by the call sign Crow. No real name, no confirmed face, just a string of digital signatures, intercepted commands, and ghosted transmissions. Crow was rumored to be the architect of the breach's most coordinated assaults, including the fall of Relay Point Graven, where 300 defenders were wiped out in under 2 hours. Crow's methods were precise, and their cruelty intentional. Any post believed to have been on their target list was given what soldiers called the red tag. Vanta had not been officially tagged yet, but Maynard had begun seeing patterns in the recon data that suggested they were next. She hadn't shared it with the full outpost staff yet, but Evelyn had noticed her pacing more during briefings, her tone harder, her eyes colder. The first signs came subtly, A supply convoy meant to arrive from Sector C-19 missed its scheduled delivery without alert. Drones sent to investigate lost signal after passing Ridge Point 13. A patrol unit returning from a Western scout route reported strange scorch marks on the rocks, unlike anything produced by standard resistance weapons. Then came the animal behavior. Scavenger birds circling closer than usual, desert dogs abandoning carcasses, even the hydroponic crops beginning to wilt despite proper care. Superstition, maybe, but to those who'd seen enough war, nature often noticed what humans didn't. Evelyn observed the change not through fear, but through patterns. The mechanical rhythm of the outpost had begun to falter. More guards were stationed on night watch. Training drills became more intense. Ammo was being counted and recounted, and those usually tasked with supply logistics were being trained for frontline engagement. That wasn't protocol unless command expected a direct hit. She heard whispers too. Low conversations between officers at shift changes, intercepted glances between squad leaders. One phrase kept coming up in coded fragments. Black mark, confirmed. She didn't know what it meant then, but she felt its weight. One evening, just before curfew lockdown, she passed through the outer perimeter and noticed new weld marks on the fence line. Not from maintenance, these were quick patches, hasty repairs done to fix breaches. No one had reported an attempted entry, yet someone, or something, had tested the outer defense, and no alarm had been triggered. That meant stealth. That meant breach scouts. But the enemy wasn't just beyond the walls. It was within, too. The most insidious aspect of the breach was their use of infiltration. Disguised operatives posing as drifters or tradesmen, planted in outposts weeks or even months before a planned attack, quietly feeding intel back to command. It was said that you never saw a breach mole until they pulled the trigger. And suddenly, everything Evelyn had observed, the odd gaps in radio logs, the extra crates on the last convoy manifest that had never been unpacked, the faulty security doors in the East Wing, began to feel less like accidents and more like traps waiting to be sprung. She knew the outpost didn't believe her capable of much. They thought her quiet, hesitant, untested. But she had watched the breach's pattern emerge like a bruise spreading across a map. She could feel it closing in. The conflict had already begun. It just hadn't erupted into fire yet. And at the center of the coming storm was the quiet dread that no one dared voice out loud. The next time the sirens screamed, they might not stop. What Evelyn also understood, but had told no one, was that she had crossed paths with the breach once before, long before Outpost Vanta, long before the uniform. She had a reason for being here, and it wasn't survival, it was reckoning. She had seen their cruelty, she had survived it once, and now, whether they came with flames or steel, she would not flinch. Because she had been preparing for this confrontation long before anyone else had even learned the breach's name. By the time the third week rolled around, there was a subtle but undeniable change in Wren's posture. Her shoulders, once slouched with invisible burdens, were beginning to square up. She still didn't say much, and she still avoided the firing range, but she no longer flinched when someone cocked a rifle nearby. Cale noticed this shift before anyone else did. During a morning briefing when he mentioned a perimeter sweep, Wren didn't turn pale or look down at her boots. She simply nodded. It wasn't a huge gesture, but in a place like Dustmere, where fear was currency and composure was survival, that kind of nod was louder than a battle cry. Cale made a mental note and decided to assign her to backup patrol duty, paired with Devon, who had a reputation for being annoyingly patient. Devon was the kind of guy who'd stop to explain how a leaf blew in the wind if he thought it would help someone understand battlefield tactics. Wren, naturally, bristled at the thought of working alongside him, but she didn't protest. That alone was another shift. Their patrols started in the outer circle, away from the main checkpoints, and far from the supply caravans that were often targeted. It was quiet, relatively safe, and perfect for observation and adjustment. Devon, true to form, spent the first few shifts talking about everything except weapons, bird tracks, desert foliage, cloud shapes. Ren remained mostly silent, occasionally responding with one-word answers or short glances that either meant, "I see," or "Please stop talking." But one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the canyon walls in blood-orange hues, they stumbled upon a disturbed patch of earth, too symmetrical to be natural. Devon crouched, brushing the sand aside, revealing a set of tire tracks and a partial boot print. Ren crouched beside him without hesitation, narrowing her eyes. There was a flicker of awareness there, of danger, of pattern recognition. She traced the edge of the print with her gloved finger, murmuring more to herself than to him, noting how fresh it looked. Devon didn't interrupt. He just watched her. When she finally stood, she didn't look scared. She looked calculating. Back at base, Kale listened intently to their report. Ren's observations were sharp, detailed, and presented with none of the shaky hesitation that had defined her first few weeks. Kale nodded slowly, his mind already strategizing. She wasn't just observing, she was connecting dots, forming instincts. That was the beginning. A few days later, he found her near the mechanic's workshop, watching a group of trainees dismantling rifles. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes were glued to the table where springs, bolts, and barrels were being carefully organized. Kale didn't interrupt her. He simply asked one question: "Do you want to learn?" Ren didn't look at him right away. She studied the table for another second, then gave a short nod. From then on, she trained, not with the others, but privately, in the shadow of the canyon wall behind the barracks, where the morning light didn't reach until nearly noon. Kale assigned her an old Mark 9 repeater, slightly heavy and with a stubborn kickback, but reliable. The first few sessions were slow. Her hands trembled, not out of fear but out of unfamiliarity. The weapon felt alien, a cold puzzle with no clear solution. But repetition did what repetition always does. It eroded fear, reshaped muscle memory, and reprogrammed her mind. She learned to break it down, clean it, reassemble it, and eventually, to fire it. Not gracefully, not yet, but effectively. The day she hit 3 targets in a row, she didn't smile or celebrate. She simply reloaded. And that said everything. Kale watched her progress with a mix of pride and strategic hope. He didn't praise her openly, knowing she still operated better in quiet spaces than under the weight of attention. But word began to spread. The girl who once froze during drills was now holding her own in target practice. Some of the others didn't believe it, chalking it up to Kale's overprotective instincts. Others were quietly impressed. Devon, of course, became her unofficial hype man, but even he knew not to overdo it. He respected the boundaries she maintained between her and the rest of them. But the transformation didn't stop at marksmanship. Ren began to speak more during debriefs, offering insights about patrol routes, terrain weaknesses, and blind spots that had gone unnoticed for weeks. She developed a sense for danger, not the dramatic kind, but the subtle shifts in wind, the too quiet trails, the missing birdsong. Kale started giving her more responsibility, and when the next supply convoy required a 2-person escort through unstable terrain, he paired her with a young scout named Lyra, who had never seen combat. That choice raised eyebrows, but Kale stood by it, and Ren didn't disappoint. When a band of raiders attempted a flanking maneuver, Ren's quick decisions, redirecting the path, covering Lyra's escape, and signaling for backup without panicking, saved the convoy and earned her a level of respect no amount of forced drills ever could. Still, she wasn't looking for recognition. In fact, when Kale tried to commend her in front of the others, she quietly deflected, saying she was just doing what needed to be done. But in the privacy of her quarters, beneath the single dim light bulb that buzzed like an insect, she stared at her gear, the cleaned rifle, the worn gloves, the dented canteen, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She didn't recognize the girl who had arrived in Dustmere, wide-eyed and trembling. She didn't mourn her either. That girl had walked through fire, and she wasn't coming back. What none of them knew yet was that this transformation was only the beginning. The true test, the one that would burn their names into the legend of Dusmere, was still coming. And when it did, no one would be asking if Ren was gun-shy ever again. By the time the third week rolled in, Erin was no longer the outsider people avoided, but the silent shadow others couldn't ignore. Her mornings were filled with drills, and her nights spent going over every field manual and strategy sheet she could get her hands on. She wasn't the loudest or the most sociable, but when it came to tasks, whether it was assembling a field tent under pressure, hiking 20 kilometers with a full pack, or hitting moving targets with a paintball gun, she was consistent, focused, and almost unnervingly calm. The instructors began to take notice. Sergeant Miro, who initially wrote her off as a liability, started assigning her to more challenging squad roles. Not to test her, but because she had started to earn a strange kind of respect. She wasn't flashy. She didn't crave validation. She just worked harder than anyone else. One night, during a cold gear maintenance exercise, the recruits were all lined up on the gravel under a flickering floodlight, each stripping down and cleaning their rifles under a timer. Everyone complained about the grit in their fingers and the numbing air. Erin said nothing. She disassembled her weapon, cleaned it, oiled it, reassembled it, and had it shoulder-ready a full 40 seconds before the timer buzzed. One of the instructors muttered under his breath, impressed, and another cadet, Jamal, leaned over and whispered with a grin, "Gun-shy, huh?" That nickname faded from the camp vocabulary quickly after that. But while Erin's performance was rising, her internal struggle was growing sharper. Her mind, though disciplined, still carried the scars of the past. The smell of gunpowder, the pop of distant shots during target practice, the sudden burst of orders screamed through radios. These moments triggered memories of that night on the farm, and sometimes she had to walk off into the woods during rest periods to breathe through the storm that rose inside her. She had no words for the mix of guilt and loss, and she never told anyone about what had happened to Cole. It stayed locked in her chest like a secret she believed would break her if it were spoken out loud. But it drove her. Each time she knelt to reload or grip the stock of her training rifle, she pictured that last night, the way Cole had tried to reach her, how she had frozen, and how she never got the chance to say goodbye. He was the reason she stayed. He was the reason she didn't quit. Then came the mountain phase. The unit was shipped out to the western cliffs of the Damar Range for their survival and advanced marksmanship week. The terrain was steep, the winds brutal, and the exercises grueling. They had to camp in high altitudes, construct emergency shelters from scratch, and hike with gear through narrow paths that overlooked sheer drops. But what broke most of the cadets wasn't the physical test, it was the navigation mission. Each team was given coordinates, a sparse map, and a 24-hour window to retrieve a marked beacon from a cave system deep within the cliffs. The twist? One person had to stay behind and guide the others remotely with only radio updates and topography notes. The instructors gave the teams freedom to choose, but in Erin's group, no one even considered nominating her. They assumed she would stay back. After all, she was the quiet one, the background support. She was useful with maps, decent with radios, and reliable with supplies. The others, more physically dominant, wanted the spotlight of retrieval. They needed the adrenaline rush. She didn't protest. She simply nodded and stayed behind. As the team descended into the terrain, navigating switchbacks and deep canyons, Erin manned the radio in the command tent. The night grew cold, and clouds rolled over the ridge, blanketing the cliffs in darkness. Signal strength dropped. Voices crackled. She knew they were veering slightly off course by the way they reported their coordinates, and she tried to correct them, but wind interference made clear communication nearly impossible. Then came the panic. One voice came through, breathless and afraid. One of the cadets had slipped, dangling by a rope, while another was trying to secure him. The rest were unsure of where they were and were nearly out of battery on the beacon. That's when Erin stood up, grabbed a cold rifle, a fresh battery pack, and a thermal map, and without asking for permission, she bolted into the storm. Nobody saw her leave. She navigated the path in darkness, guided only by terrain, memory, and sheer instinct. Her breaths were shallow, her steps deliberate, and her hands gripped the map like a lifeline. The rain started halfway through the descent, turning rocks to slick glass. But she pressed on. Her thoughts were sharp and focused. No room for doubt. She followed the trail markers, cross-checked the faintest compass readings, and eventually found the signal spike near a steep ravine. There, clinging to the edge, were the three cadets, mud-covered, shivering, and wide-eyed with disbelief as they saw her emerge from the trees like a ghost. She helped secure the fallen one, tied the rope to her harness, and carefully maneuvered the group back to higher ground. When they returned to the tent hours later, drenched and exhausted, Erin didn't wait for applause or explanation. She radioed HQ, handed in the thermal map, and started drying the gear in silence. The instructors pulled her aside that night, not to reprimand her, but to commend her. It wasn't just the act of rescue that impressed them. It was her clarity, her composure, and the fact that she had risked everything without seeking approval. One of them told her, "You acted like a leader today." She didn't reply, she just nodded, as if that word, leader, was still too big to wear. But something shifted in the eyes of the other cadets from that day on. No one asked her to stay behind again. And while no one said it out loud, they all started watching her a little differently. Not as the one who froze in the face of fear, but the one who stepped into it alone when it mattered most. Under the hot, oppressive sun that bore down on the hills surrounding Clearwater Valley, Elise stood at the top of a ridge, her boots rooted to the scorched earth, as her eyes scanned the sweeping terrain below. The dusty horizon trembled in the heat waves, but her focus was absolute. Beside her, Sam adjusted his hat, sweat sliding down his temple as he checked the map again. But Elise's instincts had already locked on to the small figures emerging from the far tree line. Scouts, probably 2 of them, possibly more hiding behind. They weren't from Clearwater. She could tell by the way they moved. There was a lurking confidence to their approach, the kind that belonged to men who didn't fear consequence. Elise reached slowly for the spyglass hanging off her belt, peered through it, and then exhaled sharply. The insignia on the armbands was unmistakable, the double crescent of the Bone Dagger clan. Raiders, not just thugs passing through. These were methodical, brutal, and notoriously persistent. Elise had heard stories. Farms razed to cinders, families vanished without a trace, settlements stripped clean overnight, and now they were here. Her pulse tightened, but she didn't retreat. Not this time. They didn't attack immediately. That was the strange part. For nearly 2 weeks they lingered, like wolves circling a herd, watching, gauging, testing the town's defenses from a distance. The townsfolk grew restless. Some wanted to leave, but most had nowhere to go. The council met daily, arguing strategies that felt more like wishful thinking than real plans. Meanwhile, Sam and Elise worked tirelessly to prepare what they could: fortify weak fences, rewire the old security grid, and teach the younger ones how to handle a firearm or set a tripwire. Elise took it upon herself to train the overlooked, the women, the elderly, the overlooked teens. She knew what it felt like to be underestimated. She channeled that quiet rage into each lesson, and the once timid hands began to steady. One evening, as a bruised violet sky bled into the night, Elise sat outside the hardware shed with Lydia, the mayor's daughter. The girl was barely 16, gangly and quick-tempered, with a natural aim that reminded Elise of herself when she was younger. Lydia had just dismantled and reassembled a rifle blindfolded in under 90 seconds, and her grin beamed with pride. Elise gave a rare nod of approval, but her mind remained elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Something beyond random raids or resource theft. That instinct was proven right when Sam returned from a scouting mission with a recovered set of documents, weathered papers stamped with the Bone Dagger emblem, and cryptic notations marking Clearwater as primary extraction site, Phase 2. Extraction. That word chilled her more than anything else. This wasn't a raid. It was a campaign. systematic, planned, and aimed at something specific. The town's council panicked. Evacuation was brought up again, but Elise slammed her fist down and reminded them of the impossible roads, the ambush zones, the children. Clearwater was more than a place. It was their only refuge, a sanctuary for those discarded by war and greed. Leaving would mean extinction. The only option was to prepare for war. Reluctantly, they agreed to give her command over strategic defenses. That night, Elise barely slept. She scribbled out fortification diagrams, coordinated rotations, assigned scouts, and requested volunteers for special training. By dawn, a plan began to take shape. A resistance not of brute force but of strategy, grit, and misdirection. She wasn't building an army, she was cultivating resilience. Over the next few days, Elise pushed harder than ever. Sam coordinated supply runs while Elise led drills, her voice ringing through the fields like the crack of a whip. She taught them how to move silently, how to track footprints in dried soil, how to find high ground, and build makeshift traps. She set up decoy tents and hidden ammo stashes, and every member of the town, from the youngest to the oldest, had a role to play. Even Hank, the gruff old mechanic who once swore off ever holding a gun again, found himself reactivating the derelict auto turrets left behind from the Coalition War. But despite all their preparation, Elise knew deep down that something was still missing, something unpredictable that could tilt the odds. That something arrived in the form of a stranger named Cale, a former tactical engineer who had been hiding out in the northern ranges. Sam had found him while scouting for additional resources, and Cale, curious about Clearwater's odds and intrigued by Elise's leadership, agreed to help. His expertise with explosive traps and digital interference systems was a godsend. Together, they rigged pressure-sensitive mines along the outer trails, synchronized drone decoys, and embedded low-frequency alarms in tree hollows. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. As the final preparations neared completion, Elise felt a quiet storm settle inside her. It wasn't fear exactly, but the gravity of inevitability. The bone daggers were coming. That much was clear. But they had no idea who they were walking into. Elise had never been someone others counted on. Her trauma had once made her recoil from responsibility. But Clearwater had cracked something open in her. These people, this town, they believed in her. And now she believed in herself. For the first time since that day in the canyon all those years ago, Elise felt her hands tremble, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. On the eve of battle, the town gathered in the central square. There were no speeches, just a quiet exchange of glances, firm nods, and the unspoken agreement that no one would run. Elise stood beside Sam and Cale at the watchtower's edge, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The forest beyond the fields rustled with unnatural stillness, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. When the first warning flare lit up the sky in ghostly red, Elise gripped the twin rifles slung across her back, the metal cool against her shoulders. She had been labeled gun-shy. But tomorrow, the world would see exactly who she had become. Under the weight of responsibility and grief, Cassidy felt herself unraveling in silence. The weeks following her mother's funeral blurred together, a haze of whispered condolences and unspoken expectations. Laurel was gone, and with her went the last remnant of the life Cassidy had once known. Carefree days in the garden, soft laughter under the moonlight, lessons in both soil and strength. Her mother had not only been her moral compass but her shield, her emotional center. Now, as Cassidy stood in the quiet farmhouse, staring at her mother's gardening gloves on the hook by the door, she felt like the roots that held her to this world had been cut. She was adrift, navigating a sea of mourning in a community still trying to rally hope in the face of growing darkness. Though friends and neighbors came by with kind words and dishes wrapped in foil, none of them could fill the vacuum Laurel left behind. Cassidy moved through her days in silence, working the farm alone, tending the animals, and preparing preserves like her mother had taught her, each motion mechanical, lacking the joy that had once accompanied the tasks. What once was shared laughter during jam making had now become a hollow echo in a quiet kitchen. She barely spoke to anyone during that first month, and even then, it was mostly out of necessity. People respected her space but worried from a distance. Colton, ever mindful, dropped by a few times to check on her, but she offered him short responses and forced smiles. He left baskets of supplies on her porch without knocking. Sometimes she found fresh wood chopped and stacked neatly beside the barn, and she knew it was him. Despite her distance, he didn't stop showing up in quiet ways, respecting her process while gently reminding her she wasn't alone. Cassidy appreciated it, even if she didn't say so. Her grief ran deep, like a cold river beneath the surface, but even she could sense the growing urgency in the world outside her grief bubble. The shadows were gaining ground, and more border towns were falling. Every night, a faint orange glow painted the horizon where another village had burned. She heard whispers from the townspeople that an all-out war was coming, and the sanctuary leaders were struggling to hold the lines. Despite her sorrow, Cassidy could not ignore the call of responsibility. Laurel had always believed in the strength of their people, in standing up when the time came. Cassidy knew she would be dishonoring her mother's memory if she allowed her pain to eclipse the needs of the greater good. Slowly, she began to rejoin community meetings, first sitting in the back, saying nothing, just listening. Then, little by little, she started to offer her voice, her insight. Her knowledge of the land, the terrain, the wildlife routes, and hidden ravines became invaluable. In this fragile moment of leadership vacuum and emotional turmoil, Cassidy began to take up a small mantle, not through bravado or power, but through quiet resilience. Though she still did not carry a weapon, the townspeople started listening to her more, trusting her instincts, valuing her observations. What stirred her most, though, was an encounter one early morning at the edge of the forest. Cassidy had wandered out to a clearing near the ridge where her mother used to meditate. The fog was thick, and the world felt muffled. She knelt in the dewy grass, brushing her fingers over a patch of wild lavender her mother had planted years ago. As she knelt in silence, a rustle behind her made her heart jolt. She stood, prepared to run, but found herself face to face with a girl, no older than 10, trembling, barefoot, with soot on her cheeks. Cassidy instinctively wrapped her arms around the girl and brought her back to the farmhouse. Her name was Sarah, an orphan from one of the burned towns. Her village had been ambushed by the shadows, and she had escaped through the woods, wandering for 2 days without food or direction. Sarah barely spoke for the first week, but when she did, it was only to Cassidy. She told her about hiding under floorboards while her family was taken, about the dark-robed figures with glowing red eyes, about the silence that followed. Cassidy listened, each word sinking into her bones. In caring for Sarah, she began to feel something shift, like a second chance was blooming in the ashes. Laurel had once saved Cassidy from a firestorm of her own. Now Cassidy felt the echo of that same legacy tugging at her. The girl needed more than safety. She needed someone to fight for her future. And for the first time since Laurel's death, Cassidy felt purpose return to her limbs. She started training, not with guns, not yet, but with tracking, endurance, and survival skills. She ran the mountain trails again, this time carrying Sarah on her back to build strength and trust. She taught the girl how to forage, how to use a bow, how to listen to the forest. And quietly, at dusk when no one was watching, Cassidy began to practice shooting again, alone behind the barn, using her mother's old target tree. Her hands trembled at first. Memories surged like thunder, Laurel falling, blood-staining green grass. But with each shot, Cassidy pushed past the fear. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about protection. For Sarah, for the town, for the legacy her mother had left behind. Slowly, the townspeople began to notice the change. The once gun-shy girl was stepping into something more, something powerful, something necessary. And though no one said it out loud, they began to believe it too, that maybe, when the final battle came, Cassidy wouldn't just be ready, she might be the one who turned the tide. The sun beat down on the rusted outposts of Stonebrush as tensions climbed higher than the thermometers nailed to its blistering walls. The Red Crows had cut off every route into the valley, blockading trade and intercepting every whisper that tried to sneak past their ever-watchful sentries. Supplies were dwindling, hope was brittle, and the council had called an emergency gathering in the old cathedral-turned-war room. For the first time since the early months of resistance, all factions and tribes, miners, merchants, sharpshooters, former gang members, and nomadic scouts, sat under one roof with the singular aim of survival. Among them sat Nora, posture firm but gaze distant, her mind replaying the chaos that unfolded the night before. Despite months of progress, she couldn't shake the image of that red crow mark on the sniper's neck. She had seen it before, on the man who had burned down the prairie homestead her family once built with their bare hands. The encounter had reopened something inside her, something raw and unprocessed. Yet now wasn't the time to dwell. Now was the time to act. Commanders took turns outlining plans, most of which ended in cautious retreat or passive resistance, but none of those felt right anymore. Stonebrush couldn't afford passivity, not when it was surrounded by enemies emboldened by every step backward the town took. When they reached Nora for input, the room fell quiet. Eyes weighed her down, old doubts resurfacing like stale smoke. She inhaled slowly, then stood. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was steady, firm, and direct. She laid out a bold counteroffensive that involved a multi-pronged infiltration of Red Crow camps on the ridge, synchronized with a nighttime feint through Dead Man's Hollow. It wasn't just about stealing supplies. It was about fracturing the psychological grip the Crows had on the region. The plan was risky. It demanded precision, grit, and timing. But it was also the first plan in weeks that felt like it pushed back, instead of just ducking the next blow. There was silence for a moment, then murmurs. Some shook their heads. Others exchanged glances. But to Nora's surprise, a voice from the back, a wiry old tracker named Malco, stood and said, "'Bout time someone remembered what fightin' back looks like." One by one, others echoed him. Not all were convinced, but enough were willing. Preparations began that evening. Nora took a leadership role in organizing the infiltration teams, mapping routes, and rehearsing movements. The camp near the ridge was heavily fortified, but there were weaknesses. Unguarded cliffs, under-maintained fences, and guards that rotated too predictably. Nora worked late into the night, and even when the others rested, she stayed up reviewing everything again by lantern light. She couldn't afford another mistake. Not now. On the eve of the operation, her team gathered for final checks. They were a mix of hardened scouts and green, but determined volunteers, each with a weapon in hand and a weight behind their eyes. Some looked to her for reassurance. Others looked away, battling their own nerves. Nora scanned the group, then handed out final assignments. She saved the riskiest path for herself, the northeast crawl through Vulture's Edge, a sharp incline with brittle ledges and poor footing. No one argued. They knew she wasn't choosing it to prove anything. She was choosing it because she trusted herself to make it through, even if it cost her everything. The operation began at midnight. Under a sliver of moonlight, teams moved in near silence, their boots muffled by loose sand and sagebrush. Nora's breath was even, her hands steady, her senses alive to every rustle, every shift in wind. She reached the edge of the ridge, where the ground dropped into a steep basin lined with coiled fencing and lazy patrols. Using a broken segment of a dead mesquite tree as cover, she slid down slowly, then crouched beside the nearest fence. She listened. One guard. Half asleep. She waited until his head nodded forward, then moved like liquid shadow, disabling the perimeter wire with a tool she'd fashioned from old telegraph metal. She was inside. One by one, the other teams signaled completion. They'd breached the perimeter in under 15 minutes. That's when things went sideways. An explosion rang out near the east gate. Not part of the plan. Someone had tripped an alarm or misfired. Suddenly, floodlights roared to life, and gunfire erupted. Nora didn't flinch. Instead, she ran toward the noise. If the east side was compromised, it meant Red Crows would converge there, but that left their command tent, right in the middle, vulnerable. She darted past bunkhouses and storage crates, using smoke from the explosion as visual cover. When she reached the center, she saw it, 3 commanders scrambling with maps and radios. Without hesitation, she threw one of her flash bombs through the tent flap and stormed in behind it. It was chaos. Blinded and disoriented, the men were easy to disarm. She tied them with their own belts, then grabbed the communication logs and stuffed them into her vest. As she turned to leave, a shot rang out and grazed her arm. Pain bloomed, but she didn't stop. She sprinted into the darkness, heart pounding, maps in hand. The mission had shifted. They weren't just stealing food or disrupting operations. They had intelligence now, the kind that could dismantle entire chains of command. She radioed her team to fall back to the southern canyon. The maps had revealed something unexpected. The Red Crows weren't as unified as they appeared. A rift was forming between their outer squads and central leadership, and if they moved fast, they could split the army in 2 before the next dawn. As they escaped under a hail of bullets and shouted orders, Nora looked back only once, not with fear, but with resolve. She'd led the charge. She'd crossed enemy lines. And now, she carried the weapon they feared most: knowledge. The girl they once mocked for being gun-shy had just cracked open the enemy's stronghold with nothing but will, grit, and sharpened instincts. And the battle ahead was only just beginning. Under the amber light of dawn, the squad gathered at the ravine edge that separated them from the enemy's base. An old industrial complex turned into a fortified compound. The air was crisp, but heavy with tension. Sienna stood at the center of the formation, staring into the distance as though she could see through walls and smoke and fear. A week ago, the idea of her leading a strike team would have been met with laughter. Today, no one questioned it. Captain Morrow, typically in command during critical assaults, had stepped back voluntarily. He knew when someone else was more in tune with the mission than he was. Sienna had spent days drawing up the plan, anticipating every angle, every failure point, every possibility. Her sketchbooks, once filled with contour lines and anatomy studies, were now scattered with maps, formations, and coded communications. The team around her wasn't composed of hardened veterans, but of volunteers, misfits, outcasts, and survivors like herself who believed in what they were fighting for, and more importantly, who believed in her. The plan was bold. Infiltration through the sewers beneath the complex would allow them to bypass the outer defenses. Timing was crucial. They would enter at 0400, plant detonation charges to disable the power grid, then breach the west wall where the enemy had least visibility. It was ambitious, risky, and it would only work if everyone played their part with precision. Sienna didn't speak much that morning. She let her presence do the talking, her eyes scanning every face, nodding once to acknowledge their readiness. She moved with purpose, but also with a quiet humility that inspired calm. As the sun broke through the haze, she descended into the sewer tunnel first, rifle slung on her back, flashlight steady in hand. The team followed. The tunnels were narrower than expected, and the stagnant air made every breath feel like an effort. Rats scattered at their footsteps, and the echoes of their movement bounced back like whispers from ghosts. Sienna had memorized every twist of this route from stolen blueprints, but still, she checked her hand-drawn map regularly, making subtle adjustments as they moved. After nearly an hour of crawling and careful steps, they reached the grate that led directly beneath the generator room. Sienna signaled the stop. Above them, muffled voices could be heard. 2 guards on a routine patrol. They waited silently, barely breathing, until the voices faded and footsteps moved on. With a flick of her wrist, Sienna removed the grate and motioned for Kess, the demolition specialist, to move up. While Kess prepped the explosives, Sienna checked her watch. Everything was within the window. She tapped her radio mic twice. No words. Just the pre-agreed signal that Phase 1 was nearly complete. As Kess climbed back down, she whispered the timer. 6 minutes. Sienna gave her a sharp nod and led the retreat 20 feet back through the tunnel bend to shield from the initial blast. When the explosion came, it was like the roar of an angry god. Dust poured down from above, and the tunnel shook, but Sienna didn't flinch. She motioned forward and began the sprint toward the breach point. The detonation had done more than disable the generators. It caused confusion. Alarms didn't go off because power had failed. Security cameras were down. Enemy forces scrambled in disarray. At the breach wall, Brex and Juno were already in position, using thermal cutters to carve a passage through the metal. It wasn't graceful, but it was fast. They entered the compound in staggered waves, silent and ghost-like, taking out guards one by one with tranquilizers and silenced weapons. Sienna moved with the fluidity of a dancer and the instincts of a predator. She didn't hesitate anymore. Every decision came instantly, her orders clear and precise. Her mind was no longer clouded by fear. It had crystallized into focus. In the central corridor, they encountered resistance. A trio of soldiers stood ground with automatic rifles. One fired without warning. Bullets ripped through the air, grazing the concrete near Sienna's shoulder. Instinctively, she dove behind a pillar and signaled the team to fan out. Juno laid cover fire, and Brex flanked right. But what happened next marked a turning point, not just in the mission, but in how everyone would remember her. Sienna rolled out from cover, drawing both rifles from her back holsters in a single fluid motion. Dual-wielding them, she moved forward in a low stance, her eyes locked on the enemy. She didn't fire recklessly. Each shot was placed with surgical precision. One guard fell to a shoulder hit, the second to a kneecap. The third dropped his weapon entirely and raised his hands. It wasn't about killing, it was about control. The rest of the squad stared in disbelief for a heartbeat, then surged forward to secure the corridor. From that point on, the tide of the mission shifted entirely. Confidence surged through the squad like electricity. They pressed deeper into the compound, disabling weapon caches, securing prisoners, downloading enemy intel. Sienna led every room entry. She anticipated ambushes before they happened, and every time the team looked to her for the next move, she had one ready. The woman once mocked as gun-shy had become the one person no enemy wanted to face in a firefight. When they reached the final wing, the command center, they knew reinforcements would be inbound. They had 10 minutes to extract the files and exfil before enemy vehicles surrounded the facility. Sienna uploaded the encrypted data to a flash drive, stuffed it in her vest, and motioned for Brex and Kess to cover the rear. As they exited through the loading dock and ran toward the emergency extraction vehicle, enemy drones buzzed overhead, scanning for movement. One spotted them. Gunfire erupted. Sienna didn't flinch. She dropped to one knee, rifles blazing again, laying down cover fire as the others climbed aboard the truck. Her eyes were locked not on the enemy, but on her team, on their survival. She moved last, diving onto the back as the vehicle sped off, bullets trailing like sparks behind them. Her chest heaved, heart pounding, ears ringing. But she was alive, and so was every member of her team. Back at base, no one said it aloud, but the looks said it all. No more jokes, no more doubt. She wasn't the girl who couldn't pull the trigger. She was the leader who pulled off the impossible. And they all knew. They hadn't just witnessed a mission's success. They had witnessed the rebirth of someone unstoppable. The explosion shook the northern ridge like a thunderclap thrown from the heavens, cascading dirt, snow, and fear across the battlefield. Smoke curled upward like the ghost of all they had lost, and in the chaos, Ava stood still, the quietest storm in a maelstrom of violence. Her breath was steady, her eyes locked, and her hands, once known to tremble at even the suggestion of a loaded rifle, now held steel with the ease of a born marksman. She had shed her shadow, not through grand ceremony or applause, but through relentless trial and sacrifice. This final battle was not a test of her courage, it was the culmination of it. Around her, the last defense of Camp Halberd was collapsing. The outer fences had been breached, and the last units were making their final stand. Commander Reyes was wounded and missing, and what remained of the strike team had either retreated to the fallback shelter or were already gone. It was Ava and a handful of weary defenders left to keep the tide from sweeping over them all. The war had not been fair from the beginning. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and most damning of all, underestimated. But Ava had learned long ago that underestimation could be the most lethal weapon a person could possess. It was in that underestimation that she had grown, and now it was in that misunderstanding that she would strike. The dual rifles in her arms were not symbols of violence, but instruments of clarity. They spoke of her decision, her growth, her anger, her strength. One had been Nils's, the older veteran who had taken a bullet for her in the second skirmish by the rail junction. The other was Alara's, recovered in silent grief after the ambush at the Southern Canal. They were not just weapons, they were promises. Ava moved through the base like a whisper of resistance, taking calculated steps as her instincts, once dulled by fear, now burned with precision. The invading force, the Black Crest Division, had grown cocky with each advancing step. Their leader, Captain Dravon, broadcasted propaganda through the comms, as though the war was already over. His voice echoed across the radio towers. "Surrender, and your lives will be spared. Fight, and you will vanish into the dirt nameless." Ava turned the volume down without hesitation. She didn't need his words, she had her own mission. As she made her way to the control tower, the last viable command point, she passed fallen allies and burning wreckage. There was no sadness in her gait, only purpose. She reached the second level and found two remaining scouts bleeding, shielding each other behind a turntable. Ava pulled them to cover, applied field wraps to their wounds, and handed them each a sidearm. Not for war, but for survival. She left them with a single phrase, spoken not aloud, but etched into her nod and eyes. "Hold until it's done." She moved on. Outside, drones whirred through the air, their red sensors scanning for movement. Ava ducked between collapsing walls and overturned transports. She remembered each path now like second nature. She was not wandering blindly. She was moving with plan and intent. The surprise was hers to wield. When the first wave of Black Crest soldiers breached the inner perimeter, they expected disarray. Instead, they met silence, followed by controlled bursts from Ava's rifles that eliminated their lead flank before they could even set up formation. She used the echo of the corridor to disguise her next position, taking out their communications unit before they could report her presence. The enemy began shouting over their own noise, flailing into confusion. Ava melted into shadows, took another position, and continued the silent dismantling. She was not alone for long. Reports had reached Lieutenant Garrick, the squad leader assigned to this quadrant. Unlike most of the division, Garrick had heard of Ava. He had read the debriefs, reviewed the files, and studied the footage. He had laughed then, wondering how a gun-shy civilian had become the obsession of so many late-night war room meetings. But now, seeing the disarray, the bodies, and the precision of her strike, he understood. Garrick mobilized a containment force, 15 soldiers, 2 armored walkers, and an overhead drone with heat mapping. Ava had only minutes. She turned left through the collapsed barracks tunnel and emerged behind the vehicle depot. Her muscles ached, but her clarity had never been sharper. Every breath, every decision, pulsed with the knowledge that this was it. This was where she would either become legend or vanish. And the choice, she knew now, had always been hers. As the containment force zeroed in on her last known location, Ava climbed the comms tower ladder. Her legs screamed in pain. Her knuckles bled. But she didn't stop. From the tower's peak, she had a full view of the battlefield. Black Crest's forces were focused westward, unaware of her elevation. She set her rifles across the tower beam, took a moment to steady herself, then opened fire with brutal efficiency. The walkers went down first, blinding shots into their joints and vent ports. The confusion that followed bought her time to sweep the foot soldiers. Within seconds, the entire containment squad was either incapacitated or scrambling for cover. The drone spotted her too late, and she downed it with a single burst before it could transmit coordinates. Ava dropped from the tower just as a second wave advanced, and this time, she didn't retreat. She charged forward, rifles blazing. Her mind wasn't lost in panic. It was calm, a glacier beneath flame. She remembered all the nights she had practiced alone, the countless hours spent in empty fields, teaching herself control, learning the rhythm of fire and breath. It wasn't just instinct now. It was mastery. She fought like someone who had nothing left to lose but everything left to prove. Ava wasn't running anymore. She was rewriting everything they thought they knew about her, and this battlefield was her canvas. The mountain wind had shifted. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that only came before something broke loose. Something massive, something final. Silas stood with his team overlooking the gorge, watching the enemy's force gather like a coiled storm. They had pushed further than any cell had in years, retaking outposts, winning skirmishes, liberating supply routes. But now, at the edge of the Kuruk Divide, they faced the full weight of the SOVR's elite vanguard. It was a force bred for siege and slaughter, and it had already swallowed smaller resistance groups whole. What stood between the SOVR and complete dominance of the mountain regions was a patchwork of rebels who had nothing left to lose except each other. Silas looked over at Kala. She was methodical, focused, her eyes scanning the terrain below with silent calculation. No longer the timid girl who flinched at gunfire. No longer the hesitant tag-along from Rivmark who was dismissed as, quote, gun-shy. She had spent the last few weeks commanding small units, designing their defenses, and mapping the terrain with the precision of a battle-hardened tactician. And yet, she hadn't touched a firearm since that one night in the factory. She had trained with knives, set traps, even coordinated aerial drone strikes, but her aversion to pulling a trigger remained. Some had started whispering again, calling her a ghost strategist, a background mind, useful, but never in the fray. Silas didn't care. He knew better. He had seen her gut firebomb her way out of an ambush, with nothing but gasoline and a slingshot. He had seen her outwit entire enemy squads by rerouting their signals and turning them against each other. Gun or not, she was a threat, a leader. But something about today felt heavier, like destiny was nearing a pivot point, like the mountain itself was waiting to bear witness to something none of them could anticipate. The enemy came fast. Their vehicles thundered down the main ridge trail while foot soldiers flanked both sides through narrow rock veins. The rebels held their positions in makeshift bunkers and elevation towers, using timed explosives and camouflaged snipers to keep the tide from overwhelming them. Explosions thundered across the cliffs, dust clouds rising and collapsing like dying giants. Kala had positioned herself at the command post on the upper ridge, feeding intel to units via headset, marking enemy movement, coordinating fallback maneuvers when the second line started to buckle. The command center was under siege within minutes. A SOVR sub-squad had found their flank and rained mortars onto the northern ridge. Kala's eyes flicked across 3 monitors as radio chatter turned to static and screams. She bolted out of the tent, grabbing her satchel, ducking behind a crumbling wall as shrapnel whizzed past her face. Silas was down below, pinned behind an overturned truck, with 2 wounded fighters. He had lost comms and couldn't see the post anymore, only the black smoke twisting upward from where Kala had been. Then something unexpected happened. From the smoke emerged a silhouette, not fleeing, not retreating, but advancing. Kala moved through the chaos like a phantom, crouched low, zigzagging between broken stone and cratered ground. Strapped to her chest were two compact rifles, standard A-45s, lightweight but deadly in close quarters. Her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't flinch. A decade's worth of fear had burned itself out of her bones. When she reached the overlook, the cliffside that gave the perfect vantage point over the southern trail, she saw them. A full column of SOVR troops, armed to the teeth, cutting across the base of the gorge and moving toward the last fallback shelter. If they reached it, there would be no one left to stop them. No escape route, no reinforcements, just slaughter. Kala took a knee, raised both rifles, and without a word, without ceremony or hesitation, she opened fire. The first wave of bullets danced across the trail, catching soldiers mid-step. Her ambidextrous aim, trained quietly in secret during the nights no one watched, was swift and terrifying. The recoil didn't faze her. She controlled both rifles with sharp bursts, switching positions with practiced fluidity. She moved like she had always been meant for this moment. More rebels began to take notice. Some cheered, others just froze, watching the myth of gun-shy Kala dissolve in a hail of gunpowder and courage. When her mags emptied, she didn't stop. She reloaded without fumbling, rolled down the incline into a trench, and kept firing. Word spread across the battlefield. Kala was in the fight, and she was rewriting every assumption anyone had ever made about her. Silas finally got eyes on her through the smoke, saw her stance, saw her precision, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled mid-firefight. Not out of surprise, but out of pride. The tide shifted. The enemy hesitated. For all their numbers, they hadn't planned on this, on someone they dismissed becoming the spear point of resistance. The girl who once froze at gunshots had become the reckoning. As dusk began to fall, the gorge rang with the echo of her defiance. The harsh ring of gunfire echoed across the jagged canyons as dust kicked up from behind jagged boulders and old half-buried metal husks. Sylvie pressed her back against the cool stone, the wind whipping her ponytail across her face, and waited for the rhythm of shots to lull before darting across the exposed ledge. Her lungs burned, her thighs ached, but she kept going, zigzagging between cover, the dual rifles tight in her grip, their barrels still hot from the last burst. Behind her, Micah and Rafe covered her with short, disciplined bursts from their scoped carbines. The enemy had fortified the ridge ahead, a perfect vantage point for suppressing any approach to the command center nestled just beyond the ravine. It was where Kale had been taken, where the rest of their unit, those who'd been dragged from the ambush days ago, were likely imprisoned or worse. And the rebels, the real orchestrators, not just the scavenging mercenaries they'd seen before, had proven to be more organized, more brutal, and far more desperate than anyone had anticipated. Sylvie reached a slab of rusted hull that jutted up from the sand and ducked behind it, peeking through a melted hole to spot two silhouettes moving on the ridge, one with a heavy belt-fed weapon set up on a bipod. Her breath slowed, her mind sharpening in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't panic. This was purpose. She understood the terrain now, felt the rhythm of battle in her blood, and it didn't scare her. It made her precise. As she lined up her right rifle and took aim at the gunner, she barely flinched when she squeezed the trigger and sent a sharp crack through the air. The man slumped, his weapon jerking harmlessly to the side. The second rebel turned too late. Sylvie's left arm swung up instinctively, and she fired a short, controlled burst from the other rifle, sending him tumbling off the rocks. The path was opening, and the momentum shifted. Micah barked something into the comms behind her, and Rafe signaled the others to advance. This was it. They had the entry point, and if they waited too long, they'd lose the window of surprise. Sylvie pushed forward again, leaping over debris and into a narrow crevice that twisted toward the command compound's eastern perimeter. They had planned for a breach, but even Micah hadn't expected the enemy's defenses to buckle this quickly. It was Sylvie who had destabilized the line, and everyone knew it. Even in the middle of the chaos, she could feel the shift, not just in the fight, but in the way her team looked at her now. There was no more hesitation in their eyes when they followed her lead. No more doubt or shadowed whispers of her being gun-shy. She was leading this push, and they moved like a single force because of her. Inside the compound, they encountered heavier resistance. Tight corridors of makeshift steel tunnels made it impossible to flank easily, and every corner felt like it could be an ambush. The tension coiled around them, yet Sylvie's focus remained unwavering. When the next firefight exploded, she ducked low and rolled beneath a shattered support beam, rising behind two hostiles and dispatching them before they had a chance to scream. Her efficiency was almost surreal, not because she was faster or stronger, but because she trusted herself in a way she never had before. She could hear Marco's voice in her memory, soft and encouraging. When the moment comes, you won't think. You'll just know. That moment had come. They reached the central holding cells, and the lights flickered with failing power. The rebel tech infrastructure was crumbling under pressure, likely sabotaged in desperation. As Rafe cut through the magnetic locks, Sylvie and Micah stood guard, rifles raised, every sound echoing too loud. The door hissed open, and there they were. Cale, bruised but alert, and two more team members behind him. He met Sylvie's eyes, and though his lips barely moved, the expression said everything. He hadn't expected her to be the one coming through that door first, and he was damn proud she had. But there wasn't time for words. Explosions shook the ground above them. The compound was rigged, just as Micah had feared. They needed an exit, and fast. Sylvie mapped it in her head. She'd seen a side shaft earlier, partially blocked, but wide enough to squeeze through. It was a gamble, but it was the only option left. They moved as a unit now, with Sylvie at the helm, guiding them down the makeshift escape tunnel as the foundation groaned above. The dual rifles in her hands felt natural, like extensions of her limbs. The girl who used to flinch at recoil now walked with the calm authority of someone who'd stared down death and told it to wait. Dust rained from the ceilings as they emerged into the dim canyon beyond, the compound erupting behind them in a bloom of fire and debris. The concussive blast knocked them forward, but they were alive. Alive and free. The sun had begun to dip behind the ridge, casting gold and crimson shadows across the landscape as they staggered away from the destruction, coughing and bruised but whole. Micah clapped her on the back, Rafe offered a crooked smile, and even Cale, still limping from his restraints, gave her a look of raw respect. They'd done the impossible. Not just because they were well-trained or lucky, but because Sylvie, the one they'd dismissed as uncertain, had become the steady heart of their survival. And though the battle was far from over, more would come, and they all knew it. There was no longer any doubt who would lead them through the next one. The sun may have set on that day, but it rose within her. Quiet strength, once doubted, now burned in full light, and those who once called her gun-shy? They'd never utter those words again. The morning after that bitter storm of betrayal, Evelyn sat alone in the ruins of what once served as their lookout post. The winds had stilled, the smoke had cleared, but nothing felt calm. Not inside, not after what they'd lost, and certainly not after what she'd become. Around her, the remaining survivors moved with silent urgency, rebuilding barriers, salvaging supplies, avoiding one another's eyes as if afraid of what they might see reflected back. Fear, hopelessness, guilt. They were scattered, souls dangling between resolve and retreat. But Evelyn? Something had shifted permanently. If there was a thread still tethering her to the girl who had once flinched at the recoil of a hunting rifle or shivered at distant gunfire, it had snapped in the night. She wasn't that girl anymore. She had buried her beside what remained of Maddox's body and the ashes of trust. As if echoing her thoughts, the horizon rumbled with distant engine growls, the unmistakable sound of enemy movement. West Ridge had fallen. The scouting team had confirmed it just hours earlier. If North Hollow collapsed next, they'd be surrounded. They needed to act, and fast. The others suggested retreat, arguing they'd regroup at Sanctuary Pass. Evelyn, standing in the broken light filtering through a splintered window frame, said no. "We hold this ground," she told them, her voice low and calm. "We set the trap. We finish what they started." No one laughed at her anymore. No one dismissed her as gun-shy. They only watched with wary respect. Or was it disbelief? Perhaps both. Plans were laid out swiftly, with Evelyn at the helm. They would use the ruined village to their advantage, funneling the enemy into narrow choke points, lined with explosives and heavy cover. And when it came to close combat, they'd stand their ground with everything they had left. Evelyn volunteered for the North Barricade, the most exposed and least desirable post. That alone told them all they needed to know about how far she'd come. The final battle began at dusk. Crimson light stretched across the hills as the enemy emerged, more in number than they'd anticipated. Waves upon waves of armored vehicles and foot soldiers, fanning out like a shadow consuming the dying light. Yet Evelyn stood tall atop the barricade, dual rifles strapped across her chest, hair pulled back tight, eyes locked forward. She didn't tremble. She didn't blink. The girl they once doubted had become their symbol. And when the first shot rang out, it was hers. Precise. Relentless. Ruthless. In the chaos that followed, Evelyn became a ghost, weaving through fire and ruin. She moved like she'd done this her entire life, one rifle in each hand, dropping enemies with a surgeon's efficiency. The way she pivoted, reloaded, switched grip mid-motion, it was as if Maddox's memory had possessed her, or maybe she'd become the version of herself he had always seen. She wasn't fueled by vengeance, not anymore. What moved her was clarity, the cold steel of purpose forged through pain. Around her, others rallied. Seeing her fight broke something open in them, a dam of despair, replaced by raw determination. They screamed her name like a battle cry. "Evelyn! Evelyn! Evelyn!" Each syllable fell between rifle cracks, punctuating the chaos with hope. She led them forward through shrapnel and screams, downed enemies in friendly fire. When the west flank faltered, Evelyn was there, pushing through the wreckage, picking up wounded fighters, covering their retreat with a hail of bullets. When the command tower took a direct hit and panic surged, it was Evelyn who climbed the debris and signaled with a flare, red for regroup, the plan they'd all memorized like scripture. At one point, smoke covered everything, a blinding blanket of gray. Gunfire became guesswork, breath held in for long seconds. That's when Evelyn disappeared. They didn't see her for almost 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Rumors swirled even in the middle of battle. She'd been hit. She'd run out of ammo. She'd gone to detonate the fallback traps herself. No one knew. But then, just as the enemy reached the inner courtyard where the last line was failing, Evelyn burst from the second story of a collapsed building, both rifles blazing. Dust trailing behind her like wings of ash, she charged into the heart of the chaos, every shot deliberate, clearing the path to the central gate. She was the tip of the spear. And they followed. The enemy faltered for the first time that night, stumbling beneath the weight of a force they hadn't expected. Not numbers, not firepower, but one woman who refused to break. Evelyn didn't just fight like a soldier. She fought like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. At one point, a grenade landed near the med tent. Without thinking, Evelyn hurled her body toward it, kicking it away at the last second. The blast threw her backward into a pile of crates. She lay still for only a moment before dragging herself up, spitting blood, and firing again. There was no stopping her. And by the time the last shot was fired, the final scream silenced, and the enemy began their retreat, it wasn't their defenses that had held the ground. It was her. Evelyn, the girl they once labeled gun-shy, had become the storm. The sun rose over North Hollow with an eerie calm, dew settling over charred wood and broken helmets. Survivors emerged, wounded but standing. Fires still smoldered. Bodies lay silent, friend and foe. But at the center of it all stood Evelyn, covered in soot and blood, her rifles now empty, hands still clenched in readiness. The silence was deafening. Then someone clapped. Then another. And then came the cheers. Raw, hoarse, broken, but real. Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't weep. She only looked out past the smoking hills and whispered something no one else heard. But maybe it was a goodbye. Or maybe it was a beginning. The sun was setting behind the smoldering ridges, casting long golden shadows over the battlefield that had once been a peaceful valley. Smoke curled into the sky in delicate ribbons, painting the horizon with a haze of ash and fading firelight. The aftermath of the final battle was not just in the shattered terrain or the broken weaponry strewn across the fields. It was in the silence, the kind of silence that comes only when the storm has truly passed. In the center of that solemn hush stood Wren Talbot, her dual rifles still cradled in each hand, her breath steady, her eyes no longer filled with fear but with quiet resolve. Around her, the remaining defenders of Caldrith moved slowly, treating the wounded, mourning the fallen, and dismantling the remnants of the enemy's war machines. But more than that, they were watching her, many still stunned by the transformation that had unfolded before their eyes. The girl they had once whispered about, dismissing her as fragile, as hesitant, as gun-shy, had become the woman who led the charge, who stood her ground when all others faltered, and who had turned the tide when defeat seemed inevitable. Commander Idon emerged from the line of field medics, his arm bandaged, a deep cut tracing his brow, but a broad, genuine smile carving through the grime of battle. He said nothing at first, only gave Wren a single respectful nod, the kind that carried the weight of every doubt once cast and every ounce of belief now earned. She gave a small nod back, acknowledging him, but already her gaze was shifting beyond him, toward the people of Caldrith, now safe, now free. She saw children reunited with parents, medics embracing survivors, elders lighting lanterns for those who would never return, and in that sea of emotion and memory, she spotted Eleanor, kneeling beside a stretcher, helping a young boy drink water, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her expression one of exhausted relief. Wren moved toward her, rifles finally lowered, the weight of them now symbolic rather than burdensome. When Eleanor looked up and saw her, she stood quickly, rushing into Wren's arms, holding her tightly, their embrace speaking all the things that words could never fully express. After a moment, they pulled apart slightly, and Eleanor rested her forehead against Wren's, her voice a whisper barely audible through the chaos of the aftermath. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. That night, under the stars and flickering lanterns, a gathering was held on the very ground where the final stand had occurred. It was not a celebration in the traditional sense, there was too much sorrow for that, but it was a moment of unity, of gratitude, of honoring those who stood and those who fell. Wren was called to the front by the village elders and Commander Idon, and though she hesitated, she walked forward, each step echoing in the quiet respect that blanketed the crowd. A makeshift stage had been built from the remnants of a shattered transport, and from that modest platform, Idon addressed the people, recounting not just the battle but Wren's role in it, the girl who once flinched at the sound of gunfire who had become the symbol of their resistance. Then he turned to her, offering her a new set of weapons, not ones of war, but ceremonial blades crafted by the village blacksmith, engraved with the names of the fallen and the date of their victory. They were not tools of violence but symbols of guardianship, of promise, of legacy. Wren accepted them with trembling hands, overwhelmed not by the honor, but by the sheer scope of what had been overcome. She stepped forward, cleared her throat, and for the first time, spoke to the village not as a student, not as a survivor, but as a leader. She spoke of fear, not as weakness, but as a compass, a signal to what mattered most. She spoke of choice, the choice to run or to stand, to doubt or to believe. And she spoke of love, how it was not just between two people, but in the bonds of community, in the sacrifice for strangers, in the courage to rise when everything seemed lost. When she finished, there was no applause, only silence, deep, reverent, tear-filled silence. And then a single voice from the back said the words that had once been mockery, now transformed into truth. "She's gun-shy," they said. Laughter followed, soft and knowing. "Ads." Then another voice called out, "Not anymore." In the days that followed, the defenses were rebuilt, the wounded began to heal, and the name Wren Talbot became more than just a name. It became a story passed down from elders to children, a symbol not just of victory, but of what it means to face fear and choose love, to carry grief and still move forward. Wren and Eleanor continued their work, rebuilding not just structures, but lives. They turned the old infirmary into a school for both medicine and combat, believing that the best defense for the future was knowledge, empathy, and preparation. And every now and then, Wren would walk the ridges alone, the ceremonial blade strapped to her back, the memory of battle whispering through the wind. She no longer flinched. She no longer doubted. She no longer carried shame in the title once given to her. Because she knew what it had taken to become who she was. And she knew that the girl who was once gun-shy had become a legend. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.